For about 20 minutes a day, in the hour the light begins to fail, something happens in the north of Italy that does not look like it should be possible. A wall of bare rock, pale and gray and cold all afternoon, starts to glow. Not catch the light, glow. From the inside, it seems, the stone warms to a soft rose, then a deeper pink, then a burning orange, as if someone had lit a fire behind the mountain and the mountain had decided to let it through. The snow on the peaks turns the color of a peach. The shadows in the valleys go violet. And for those few minutes, the whole range looks less like geology and more like a thing that is dreaming. It is not subtle. It is not a faint tint you have to squint to notice. It is the entire mountain, kilometers of stone, catching fire all at once, while the world below sinks into cool blue shadow. People stop their cars. They stop their conversations. A whole valley of strangers turns, at the same moment, to face the same wall of light. And nobody says anything, because there is nothing to say. The people who have lived beneath these peaks for 1,000 years have a word for it. They call it enrosadira. It means, roughly, the becoming rose. And they will tell you, the old ones, that the color is a memory the mountains keep. You have probably seen the Alps in photographs. Snow, dark pine, gray granite, the clean hard lines of Switzerland. None of that prepares you for this, because these are not those mountains. These are something stranger, paler, more vertical, more impossible. Towers and spires and sheer cliffs the color of bone and cream, standing in green meadows full of wildflowers, with little wooden villages tucked at their feet and the smell of wood smoke in the air. This is the Dolomites. And for the next while, you are going to walk into them, hour by hour, valley by valley, until you understand why the people who come here once spend the rest of their lives trying to find a reason to come back. We will stand at the foot of walls that used to be the floor of a tropical ocean. We will sit on hut decks 2,000 meters in the sky, with a board of smoked ham and a coffee and the whole range in front of us. And we will wait, at the end, for the light to fail, because that is the one thing these mountains exist to do. Let me show you a place that turns to rose gold at sunset, as if the rock itself were dreaming. But first, the arrival, because the way you come into these mountains matters. You do not stumble onto the Dolomites. You climb toward them. The roads rise out of the flat, hot Italian plains, leave the vineyards and the cities behind, and begin to wind up through dark forests of spruce and larch, the air growing cooler and cleaner with every turn. Your ears pop. The light changes, goes sharper, more silver. And then the trees thin, the valley opens, and you see them for the first time, far ahead, floating above the green like something that has not quite agreed to be solid yet. Nobody is ready for that first sight. People pull their cars over. They get out and stand at the edge of the road, not speaking, just looking at a horizon that does not behave the way a horizon is supposed to. Those pale towers, catching the sun, seem to hover. The mind keeps insisting they must be clouds, or a trick of the light, because rock does not stand up in the sky like that. And then you understand that they are real, that you are going to drive right up into them, that you will spend tonight sleeping at their feet, and something opens up in your chest that does not close again for the rest of the trip. Start with the thing nobody believes until they stand in it. The shape of the land. Most mountains rise the way you expect mountains to rise. They build slowly, a slope here, a ridge there, a gradual climbing toward a summit. The Dolomites do not do that. They erupt. They go from soft green meadow to vertical cliff in a single step, with no warning, no foothills, no apology. One moment you are walking through a pasture where cows wear bells and the grass is full of buttercups. The next you look up and a tower of pale stone is going straight into the sky above you, 600 meters of sheer wall, and your neck cannot tilt far enough to find the top of it. It is disorienting in the best possible way. Your eye keeps trying to make sense of it and keeps failing. These cannot be real, some part of your brain insists. Rock does not stand up like that. And yet there it is, casting a cold shadow across the warm field, so solid you could put your hand on it. The most famous of these shapes are three of them standing in a row, called the Tre Cime di Lavaredo, the three peaks of Lavaredo. Three colossal fingers of stone, flat-topped, sheer-sided, lined up like sentinels against the sky. You can walk a path that loops right around their base, and as you go the three peaks shift and overlap and separate again, so that the whole mountain seems to turn slowly as you move, showing you a different face with every step. People come from the other side of the world to walk that loop. When they finally stand beneath those walls, most of them go quiet. There is not much to say. The scale says it for you. Stand there long enough and you start to notice the small things that make the bigness bearable, a trickle of meltwater crossing the path. The sudden cold when a cloud slides across the sun. The way sound behaves strangely against the walls, so that a voice from far across the basin arrives clear and close, as if whispered beside you. Above, the rock is streaked gray and gold and rust, scarred by 1,000 winters, and where the snow still clings in the high gullies it is the blue-white of old ice. You feel very small. It is a good feeling. It is, in fact, the feeling people travel here to have. And these particular 3 peaks have a kind of fame all their own. Their north faces, the sheer vertical walls on the shadowed side, are among the most celebrated rock walls in the world of climbing, drawing the very best mountaineers from every continent to test themselves against the stone. Look up at those faces in the late afternoon and you may see them, tiny human specks halfway up a wall the size of a skyscraper, impossibly small against the rock, inching upward into the cold. You do not have to climb a meter of it yourself to feel the pull. Standing safely at the bottom, watching the light move across those faces, is enough to make your stomach drop and your heart lift at the same time. And here is the first thing that will change how you see all of this. Reach out and touch that pale stone, run your hand across it, and you are not touching a mountain. You are touching the bottom of the sea. Look closely at the rock, in the right place, with the right light, and you will find them. Shells, coral, the curled shapes of creatures that lived and died in warm shallow water. Because 250 million years ago, this entire region was a tropical ocean. Where you are now standing, in the cold thin air, there was once warm, shallow water full of life, and reefs growing in the sun. The peaks above you, those pale towers that scrape the clouds, were once those reefs, on the floor of a warm sea, built up grain by grain over millions of years by tiny living things in the sunlit shallows. Then the continents moved. Africa pushed north into Europe, slowly, with unimaginable force, over tens of millions of years, and the seabed buckled and folded and lifted, and the old reef was driven up into the sky. The ocean floor became the rooftop of Italy. That is what gives the rock its strange pale color, this mineral called dolomite, and its strange habit of standing in vertical walls instead of slopes. The range even takes its name from that rock, and the rock takes its name from a French scientist who first described it more than 200 years ago. So the mountains are pale because they are made of the dead of a vanished sea, and they carry, in their very name, the memory of the man who realized what they were. In 2009, the world recognized what the people here always knew. The Dolomites were named a World Heritage Site, protected forever, listed both for their beauty and for that astonishing story written in the stone. One of the finest records anywhere on Earth of how life recovered after the greatest extinction the planet has ever known. The peaks are not just lovely, they are a document. They are the planet's own handwriting, telling the story of how the world died once, almost completely, and slowly taught itself how to live again. So when those walls turn rose gold at sunset, you can think of it however you like. As physics, light scattering in the evening air. Or as the locals do, as the memory of the sea the mountains came from, glowing once more before the dark. Both are true. That is the thing about this place. The science and the magic say exactly the same sentence. If standing at the foot of a 600-meter wall that used to be the floor of a tropical ocean does something to you, then you already understand this channel. Subscribe to Unseen Countries, and stay with me, because before we are done I am going to take you to a lake so still it holds the whole range upside down, and to a hut on a cliff edge where you can sleep with the peaks turning pink outside your window. Now come down off the high rock and into the valleys, because the Dolomites are not only stone, they are a place where people live, and the way they live here is its own kind of marvel. Drive into one of the long green valleys, Val Gardena, Val di Funes, Alta Badia, and the first thing you notice is how impossibly neat everything is. The meadows are mowed in clean stripes. Wooden farmhouses sit on the slopes with geraniums spilling red from every window box, their roofs steep against the winter snow, woodpiles stacked with a precision that looks almost obsessive. Onion-domed church towers rise from the valley floors. Above it all, always, the pale walls of the peaks, so that every single view looks like it was arranged by someone with an unfair eye for beauty. There is one valley in particular, Val di Funes, where a tiny church stands alone in a green meadow with an enormous jagged wall of rock rising behind it, and it is so perfectly composed. So exactly like a thing you would invent if you were inventing a paradise, that the first time you see it you almost laugh. It is not arranged. No one built it that way on purpose. The church was simply put where the village needed a church, and the mountain was already there, and the meadow grew where meadows grow, and the result is one of the most photographed scenes in all of Europe. People stand at the edge of that field and they do not speak, they just look, and try to make the moment last. And then you hear the language, and you realize you are somewhere genuinely strange. In one village they are speaking Italian. In the next, German. And in a handful of high valleys, you will hear something else entirely, older than both, a language called Ladin. It is one of the oldest living languages in Europe, descended from the Latin the Romans brought into these mountains. And it survived up here for 2,000 years because the valleys were so deep and the winters so long that the wider world simply never managed to wash it away. Fewer than 30,000 people still speak it. Most of them live within sight of these peaks. Think about that for a moment. While empires rose and fell on the plains below, while languages were born and died across the whole of Europe, a handful of people in a few high valleys kept speaking the words their ancestors brought up the mountain 20 centuries ago. They have their own songs, their own legends, their own names for every peak and pass and meadow. The kings of Ladin folklore still live in the stories the children are told. And when you hear it spoken in a village shop, soft and rounded and unlike anything else you know, you are hearing something that survived purely because these mountains were too steep and too cold for the outside world to bother climbing. So this is a place with three souls in one body. Italian warmth, Austrian order, and underneath both, the quiet, stubborn old heart of the Ladin people, who were here first, and named these mountains in words you will not hear anywhere else on earth. And those Ladin people gave the mountains their most beautiful story, the one that explains, in the way that only an old story can, why the rock turns pink at dusk. They are sometimes called the Pale Mountains, and the legend says they were once dark, like every other range, and that a prince of these valleys fell in love with the princess of the moon. She came down to live with him, but she could not bear the darkness of the earthly mountains after the soft silver light of her home, and she began to fade and sicken. So, the story goes, the little people of the mountains, the dwarves who lived in the high rock, spun the pale light of the moon into a thread, and wove that thread across every peak and wall and spire, until the whole range shone soft and pale, and the princess could stay. That is why the mountains are the color of moonlight. And that is why, at sunrise and at sunset, when the light comes in low and warm, the moonlight in the stone catches fire, and the peaks blush rose. It is only a story. But stand beneath those walls when the enrosadira comes, and tell me it does not explain the thing better than any textbook ever could. The Ladins kept hundreds of stories like that, a whole world of kings and witches and enchanted kingdoms hidden in the rock, passed down by word of mouth through the long winters when there was nothing to do but sit by the stove and talk. Many were nearly lost, written down only at the last moment, a century or so ago, by people who realized that an entire mythology was about to vanish with the old generation. They saved it. And so the children here still grow up knowing that the pale walls above their villages are not just stone. They are a kingdom with a memory, and a heartbreak, and a reason for the color of the light. You feel all of it most clearly at the table. Stop at a mountain farmhouse in the early afternoon and order a merend, the traditional snack of these valleys, and they will bring you a wooden board. On it, Speck, the local cured ham, cold smoked over beechwood and aged in mountain air until it is dense and dark and faintly sweet. Sliced thin enough to see through. Beside it, hard mountain cheese, dark bread, a few pickles, maybe a smear of horseradish that goes straight up the back of your nose and makes your eyes water. You eat it with your fingers, on a terrace, with the peaks in front of you and the cowbells ringing somewhere below, and it is one of those meals that you will think about, with a physical ache, for years, or go for the nuddle. Bread dumplings, the size of a fist, made from yesterday's bread and speck and herbs, served either floating in a clear golden broth or rolled in melted butter and showered with cheese. This is not Italian food the way you think of Italian food. There is no sun-warmed Mediterranean here. This is the food of long winters and hard work and short cold days, food built to keep a body warm at altitude. It is rib-sticking, generous, deeply comforting. And then, because you are still in Italy after all, you finish with an espresso so good it has no right to exist in a wooden hut 300 kilometers from Rome. And if you have any room left, there is the strudel. Thin pastry wrapped around soft spiced apples, dusted with sugar, still warm, eaten on a sunlit deck with the whole range in front of you. It is the most Austrian thing on the menu in the most Italian country in the world, and it tastes, somehow, of exactly this place, this scene where two cultures meet and decided, long ago, to feed each other well. And all of it comes from the mountain itself. The cheese is made from the milk of cows that spend the summer grazing the high alpine meadows, where the grass is full of wildflowers and herbs, and you can taste it, a faint sweetness, a hint of flowers, in the cheese they press from that milk. The speck hangs in cold smoky lofts through the winter. The bread is dark and dense and seeded, made to last. In autumn, the villages hold the descent of the cattle from the high pastures, a festival called the Almabtrieb, where the cows come down the mountain at the end of the grazing season wearing enormous headdresses of flowers and ribbons and bells, the whole valley turning out to meet them with music and food and beer. It is one of the warmest, most joyful things you can witness in these mountains, a whole community celebrating, simply, the turning of the year and the safe return of the herds. Here is the detail that always makes people smile. Many of these high mountain restaurants are not reached by road at all. You get to them by cable car, or on foot, or in winter on skis. You arrive at a rustic wooden hut clinging to a slope at 2,000 meters, you sit on a sun-warmed deck above a sea of peaks, and a waiter brings you a plate of handmade pasta and a glass of cold local wine as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. In the Dolomites, it is. These huts have a name. They are called Rifugi, refuges, and they are the secret that turns these mountains from a place you look at into a place you can live inside. A refugio is a mountain inn, scattered high on the trails, often in spots so remote and so beautiful they seem invented. Some are small, a handful of bunks and a wood stove and a single long table where strangers eat shoulder to shoulder. Some are grand old stone lodges with whole dining rooms and 100 years of history in their walls. But they all offer the same astonishing thing. You can walk for hours, deep into the high country, far past where any road reaches, and instead of having to turn around and come back down, you can simply stay. A bed, a hot dinner, a glass of something, a breakfast at dawn, and then you walk on the next day to the next one. It means you can cross the entire range on foot, hut to hut, for days, carrying almost nothing, sleeping each night somewhere new and impossibly high. There are famous long routes that do exactly this, threading from refuge to refuge across the heart of the mountains, and people who walk them come back changed. You carry only what fits on your back, a change of clothes, a little money, a sense of where you are going. Everything else, the bed, the dinner, the wine, the morning coffee, waits for you at the next hut. It is a way of moving through mountains that feels almost medieval in its simplicity, and it strips away, day by day, everything that is not the walking and the looking and the eating and the sleeping. By the third day you have forgotten what you were worried about back home. By the fifth, you are a different person, lighter, slower, more awake. Imagine waking before dawn, stepping out onto a wooden balcony in the cold thin air, and watching the first light touch the peaks while they turn that impossible rose. A pot of coffee. Total silence. Nothing below you but cloud filling the valleys like a white sea, and the pale summits rising out of it as if they were islands in an ocean of air. There is a particular kind of evening that happens in a refugio, and once you have lived it you understand why people give years of their lives to these mountains. The sun goes down. The temperature drops. Everyone who has been walking all day crowds into the warm wooden dining room, and the windows fog, and there is soup, and red wine, and the slow happy tiredness of a body that has earned its rest. Nobody is on a phone, because there is no signal. Strangers from 6 countries end up at the same long table, laughing, sharing food, pointing at the map, planning tomorrow. And then someone says, quietly, "Look outside," and everyone turns, and the last of the enrosadira is burning on the peaks beyond the glass, and the whole room goes silent at once. If that image alone made you want to stand on that balcony with that coffee in your hands, then do me one small thing. Tap the like button. It is the simplest way to tell me these are the places worth chasing, and it helps this kind of slow, quiet, beautiful corner of the world find the people who are aching to see it. Now, the lakes. Because the Dolomites do something with water that has to be seen to be believed. Tucked among the peaks, fed by snowmelt and held in by the old glacial rock, are lakes of a color that does not seem natural. Deep emerald. Brilliant turquoise. A green so vivid and so clear that you can see the pale stones on the bottom through 20 feet of water. The color comes from the rock itself, from fine mineral dust ground up by ancient ice and suspended in the cold water, catching the light and throwing back only the green. But knowing why does not make it any less startling when you first see it. You round a bend in the forest, and there it is, a sheet of liquid jewel held in a bowl of pale stone, and your whole body stops. The most famous of them is called Lago di Braies, and to stand on its shore at first light is to understand why people travel half the world to do exactly that. It sits in a bowl of forest at the foot of an enormous pale massif. There is an old wooden boathouse on the bank, weathered and dark, with rows of little wooden rowing boats tied up beneath it, and at dawn, before the wind comes, the surface goes perfectly, glassily still. And then the mountain appears twice. Once above, real and solid, going up into the sky. And once below, in the water, a perfect mirror, every spire and every snowfield reflected so cleanly that for a moment you genuinely cannot tell where the mountain ends and the reflection begins. The whole range, hanging upside down in green glass. A boat drifting across it seems to float in midair, suspended between two skies. People come at sunrise, and they whisper, even when no one has asked them to. There is something about that double mountain, that perfect stillness, that makes noise feel wrong. This is the kind of place that does not photograph the way it feels. A photo flattens it. Standing there, in the cold morning air, with the smell of pine and cold water and the only sound the soft knock of a wooden boat against the dock, you feel the size of it in your chest. The cold comes off the water and touches your face. The light climbs the far wall, inch by inch, turning gray to gold. It is one of the most beautiful places in Europe, and for a few hours each morning, before the day fills it with people, it is almost entirely yours. You can take one of those wooden rowing boats out yourself, push off from the dock, and row slowly into the middle of the lake, the oars dipping with a soft splash, the only other sound the drip of water off the blades. Out there, in the center, you stop rowing and let the boat drift, and the mountain hangs above you and beneath you all at once, and you are floating in the very middle of the dream. People who do this rarely speak. They just sit, and drift, and try to hold on to a feeling they know they will be chasing for the rest of their lives. And it is only one. There are dozens of others, each held in its own pocket of stone, each a different shade of impossible. A small green lake reflecting a single colossal tower. A high turquoise tarn you have to walk 2 hours to reach, and then have entirely to yourself, the only sound the wind and your own breath. The Dolomites are stitched through with water like this, hidden in the folds of the rock, and finding them, one by one, becomes its own quiet obsession. Now lift your eyes from the water to the ridgelines above it, because there is a layer to these mountains that you would never guess, and it changes how you see every peak. These serene, dreamlike mountains were once a battlefield. A little over 100 years ago, during the First World War, the front line between two great empires ran directly through these peaks, right along the highest ridges and summits. And so men fought a war up here, in the rock and the snow, at 3,000 meters, in conditions almost beyond imagining, they tunneled into the mountains. They strung cables and ladders up sheer cliffs to move men and supplies to positions among the clouds. They lived in caves carved into the stone, through winters that buried whole encampments in snow. That sounds like the heavy part of the story, but here is the gift it left behind, and it is a beautiful one. To move soldiers safely up those vertical walls, they bolted iron rungs, steel cables, and ladders directly into the rock, creating protected routes up cliffs that no ordinary person could ever scale. They called them the iron paths. In Italian, the via ferrata. And those iron paths are still there. Maintained, repaired, made safe, they now let anyone with a harness and a head for heights clip in and climb routes that would otherwise belong only to expert mountaineers. You can go straight up a sheer cliff face, hundreds of meters of open air beneath your boots, completely secure, on a path that was first built a century ago. You move through the same tunnels they dug, the rock cold and dripping in the dark, your headlamp catching old chisel marks in the stone, and then you emerge, blinking, onto a summit ridge with the whole Pale Range spread out below you in every direction, and the wind, and the silence, and a view that almost no other mountains on earth can give. There is one famous spot where you can walk right through a mountain on a tunnel the soldiers dug, climbing in the dark inside the rock, with little windows cut in the cliff face that suddenly open onto 1,000 meters of empty air and the peaks beyond. You step up to one of those windows, deep inside the stone, and the view hits you like a physical thing. It is one of the strangest, most moving walks in the Alps, and it exists because of something that should have left only sorrow behind, and instead, somehow, left wonder. What stays with people, afterward, is the quiet. You go in expecting to feel the weight of the history, and you do, a little. But mostly what you feel is the silence of the high rock, the cool breath of air moving through the tunnels, the way the mountain holds the warmth and the cold of 100 years ago at once. And then a window opens onto the light, and 1,000 meters of empty air, and a sea of peaks running away to the horizon, and the history dissolves into pure, uncomplicated awe. You came up into the stone for the view. You leave understanding something about how beauty and time work on each other, slowly, until even the hardest places soften into something you would cross the world to see. So the war that once scarred these peaks gave the Dolomites their most extraordinary gift, the ability to put almost anyone, safely, in a place that should belong only to eagles. The trenches have softened into grass, the tunnels have become trails, and the iron driven into the stone now carries travelers up into the most beautiful high places in the Alps. Time has done here what time so rarely does. It has turned a wound into a doorway. Which brings us to the simplest pleasure these mountains offer, and maybe the greatest one. Being up high, with no effort at all. You do not have to be a climber to get into the heart of the Dolomites. The valleys are laced with cable cars and gondolas, and they will lift you, in minutes, from a warm village square to a summit station 2,500 meters in the sky. You step out of a glass cabin into thin, bright, cold air, and the world simply falls away beneath you. Pale peaks in every direction, as far as you can see, ridge after ridge after ridge, fading from gray to blue to the palest silver at the horizon. Below, the green valleys, tiny, with their toy villages and their thread-like roads. The ride up is half the wonder. The cabin lifts off the ground and suddenly the village is a model beneath your feet, the church a toy, the cars like beads on a string, and then the ground drops away entirely as you swing out over a gorge. And there is nothing below you but treetops and the silver thread of a river. And ahead, filling the whole window, the wall of pale rock you are rising to meet. From up there you can walk along the high meadows, soft alpine grass dotted with gentian and edelweiss, with the great walls rising right beside you. In summer the air smells of warm pine and crushed herbs and snow that has not quite gone. Marmots whistle from the rocks, stand up on their hind legs to watch you, and vanish into their burrows when you come too close. A hawk hangs motionless on the wind, riding a current you cannot see. Cowbells drift up from somewhere far below. And in the distance, always, that horizon of pale stone, those cathedral spires that turn to fire each evening. High above all of this, the golden eagles still ride the thermals along the great walls, and if you are lucky you will see one, a dark cross hanging impossibly still against the pale rock. And then folding its wings and dropping, faster than you can follow, down the face of a cliff and out of sight. The chama, the wild mountain goats of the Alps, pick their way across ledges that look like nothing could possibly stand on them, sure-footed on the sheer rock, watching you with calm dark eyes before they bound away. In the high silence, far from any road, you can hear things you forget exist in the lower world, the wind moving over stone, the trickle of meltwater under a snowfield, the sudden clatter of a falling pebble somewhere far above, and then nothing at all, a silence so complete it seems to have weight. There is a road, too, that no one who comes here should miss. It climbs out of the valleys in a series of switchbacks so tight and so theatrical that they have become legendary, curling up over high passes with the great peaks rising on either side, the whole Pale Range opening up around every bend. Drivers come from across the world simply to feel a car move through scenery like this. You round a corner and a new massif fills the windscreen. You crest a pass and a whole valley falls away below you, green and gold in the afternoon light. It is, quite simply, one of the most beautiful drives on the planet, and you can do it with the windows down and the cold sweet air pouring in. This is the thing the Dolomites understand better than almost anywhere else. That the most extraordinary beauty should not be locked away for the few who can suffer to reach it. Here, the sublime is generous. A grandmother and a small child can ride a cable car to a terrace at 3,000 meters, order a slice of apple strudel, and sit in the sun looking out over one of the great views of the world. The wonder is shared. It is for everyone, and somehow that makes it feel even larger. There is a second season, too, that turns this whole place into something else entirely. When the snow comes, the green valleys go white and silent, the wooden villages light up gold against the dark, and the peaks become pale ghosts against a black winter sky. Skiers carve down slopes with the great towers all around them, sleighs cross the snow, smoke rises straight up from the chimneys in the still cold air. And on a clear winter evening, the enrosadira still comes, the rose-gold light climbing the snow-laden walls just as it does in summer, only now the whole world below is white and frozen and hushed, and the color on the peaks looks even more like a thing from a dream. And there is the night to consider, which most people never stay for. When the last of the light has gone, and the valleys are dark, look up. There is very little to dim the sky up here, no great cities throwing their glow against the dark, and so the stars come out in a density that most people have simply never seen. The Milky Way arches over the pale silhouettes of the peaks, thick and bright, a river of light spilled across the black. The air is cold and still and smells of pine and snow. The only sound is the distant murmur of a stream somewhere far below. And the great walls stand there in the starlight, pale even in the dark, holding their shape against the sky, patient, as they have been for 250 million years and as they will be for 250 million more. So here is what I want to ask you, now that you have stood in all of it. If you had a single morning in these mountains, just one, where would you spend it? On the still shore of Lago de Braies, watching the peaks hang upside down in the water? On an iron path bolted to a cliff a century ago, climbing into the clouds? Or on a sunlit hut deck at 2,000 meters, with a board of Speck and a coffee and the whole range in front of you? Tell me below. I genuinely want to know which one called to you, because I think the answer says something about the kind of traveler you are. There is one more thing, and it only happens if you stay until the day is almost gone. Most visitors leave in the afternoon. They have seen the lake, ridden the cable car, eaten the dumplings, and they drive back down toward the cities while the sun is still high. They miss it. They miss the only thing these mountains exist to do. Because if you stay, if you find a spot, a meadow, a balcony, a quiet bend in a trail, and you simply wait as the light goes gold and then amber and then begins to fail, you will see it. The walls will start to warm, the gray will bleed away, and the rose will come, climbing the rock from the bottom up, the whole vast range lighting like a coal, pink and then deeper pink and then a burning orange against a sky going violet behind it. The valleys fall into shadow first, going cool and blue, while the peaks above hold the last of the day, blazing, suspended, as if they were lit from within. The enrosadira, the becoming rose. The memory of the sea, glowing one last time before the night. And in that moment you understand, with no need for anyone to explain it, why people give their hearts to this place. Why they come back, year after year. Why a small word in an old mountain language outlasted empires. These are mountains that blush. Stone that remembers it was once alive. In a warm shallow sea. In the sun. And for 20 minutes each evening, they let you see it. There is a range of mountains in Italy that turns to rose gold at the end of every clear day, as if the rock itself were dreaming. You can read about it. You can look at 1,000 photographs. But you cannot feel that color climb the wall in front of you, in the cold and the silence, the breath rising from your mouth, until you are standing there yourself. So let me leave you with the only question that matters. When the light starts to fail tonight, somewhere far from here, those pale walls will turn to fire again, with or without you. The reef that became a mountain will glow one more time, the way it has every clear evening for longer than there have been people to watch it. The question is simply whether you intend to be standing there, one evening, to see it for yourself. If you want to keep finding places that make you feel like this, places that make the world feel larger and stranger and more worth the journey, then subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Unseen Countries.